Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to take a look at the call of Matthew, also known as Levi, from Matthew chapter 9. It's a fairly short text, but it's packed with significance because it demonstrates for us what the mission of Jesus was all about. That mission was about mercy. Mercy is what drove Jesus as the great physician, both of soul and body, to seek out not those who are healthy, but those who are ill, those who are sick, those who are wounded, those who are dying. People like Matthew, and of course, people just like me and you. And as we talk about this text, we'll also take a quick trip back into Hosea, which Jesus is going to quote as kind of the model that drives his mission, a mission that's all about him showing mercy, us receiving mercy, and then through the work of the Spirit, us showing mercy to those who are around us. So some great stuff to get to. We're going to kick it off with just that opening verse from Matthew 9, verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. First of all, let's take a look at the corresponding sections from Mark as well as Luke and see how there's at least some slight differences between those and Matthew's version of events. So Mark 2 and Luke chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, they basically tell this same story, but a couple of details are different. For one, we have another name from Matthew. Matthew, who of course is the author of the gospel we're looking at, calls himself Matthew as he's telling us about the day that Jesus called him to be his disciple. Now, when Mark and Luke tell the story, they name him as Levi. Of course, he bears the same name as one of the sons of Jacob and one of the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Mark tells us also that Levi is the son of Alphaeus. Now, they all talk about he's sitting at the tax booth, and Jesus says, "Follow me." And Luke adds one, I think, significant detail. After Jesus says, "Follow me," Luke says, "Leaving everything, Matthew rose and followed him." So we kind of get the picture here of Matthew engaged in his work as a tax collector, which we'll get to in just a minute. Jesus utters two words to him, "Follow me." And that invitation and the divine power that is packed into that invitation are what prompts Matthew to stand up and, as Luke says, leave everything and follow Jesus. It's really hard to imagine a more complete abandonment of everything that had characterized Matthew before and is now entrance into this new life of being a follower of Jesus, leaving everything behind. He then stands up and he follows Jesus into this new life of discipleship. So first of all, let's talk about just for a second about what this toll booth or this tax booth is, and we'll also dive a little bit deeper into what it meant to be a tax collector in the first century. So a tax booth is a telonion, and this was a booth located on the edge of a city or town to collect taxes for trade. There was a tax booth in Capernaum, which was on the trade route from Damascus to Galilee and the Mediterranean. The taxes were collected on produce and goods brought into the area for sale and were a sort of sales tax paid by the seller, but obviously passed on to the purchaser in the form of increased prices. That comes from the NET Bible First Edition notes. Now, if you're a longtime Christian, you're used to hearing stories about the tax collectors, and you know in general that they had a very bad reputation and they were classified with sinners and other ne'er-do-wells in the first centuries. But what exactly was the problem with them? And what was their occupation, and why was it so hated, especially by the religious elite as well as just by ordinary Jews in the first century? Well, I have some quotes here from the Lexham Bible Dictionary that I think are a good kind of summation of what the tax collector's occupation was all about. Tax collectors, also known as publicans, charged tolls and taxes on behalf of the Roman government. These private government subcontractors, I kind of like that phrase. I think it sums up well what their occupation was. They were private government subcontractors. These private government contractors would tax travelers who were carrying merchandise between properties or delivering goods along certain well-defined roads. Rome preferred to hire locals who were familiar with the region's inhabitants and land and roads. Some tax agents were responsible for such large territories that they functioned as subcontractors, hiring their own employees to collect the taxes. And Zacchaeus is one who fits that category. He's called a chief tax collector in Luke chapter 19. Now here, notice this important detail. Tax collectors or toll collectors, whatever you want to call them, earned a profit by demanding a higher tax from the people than they had prepaid to the Roman government. So the tax collectors, the toll collectors, they prepaid this tax, and then they collected from the people. But as they did so, they collected even more than was necessary, and this was the way in which they earned their income. And of course, as you might suspect, this system led to widespread greed and corruption, and that's why the tax collecting profession was saturated with unscrupulous people who overtaxed others to maximize their personal gain. And of course, as you can imagine, their fellow countrymen were not happy with what the tax collectors were doing. It was kind of a twofold problem that they had. First of all, they were working for the Roman government. They were working for those who basically had the Jews under their thumb. And secondly, they were collecting even more than they had to, and they were lining their pockets with this. So both kind of a sense of patriotism perhaps isn't the right word, but the sense of national unity was something that the tax collectors were attacking because they were working for the overlords, for the Roman government, but also they were looked down upon because they were taking more money from their fellow Jews. And so there was a twofold indictment against the tax collectors, and thus they were hated. They were looked down upon. They were considered to be unclean. They were considered to be beyond the pale of redemption because of their egregious activity, which was both against the people of Israel, their own people. So they were kind of traitors, but they were also then just kind of financial, greedy swindlers who were lining their own pockets, getting rich off of their own people. So that's why they have such a bad reputation in the New Testament. But notice what Jesus does. Jesus goes out of his way to call someone from that occupation to demonstrate that no one is beyond the pale of redemption. Jesus purposely calls Matthew to make sure that everybody who sees this, everybody who knows Matthew, and he would have been known, everybody who sees this, everybody who knows that now Matthew, this tax collector, is now a follower of Jesus, that Jesus came without any boundaries. He broke through all the boundaries that people had set up in order to reach beyond those and to call those that a lot of people thought were beyond redemption, were not even worth being saved. That's who Jesus came for. So there are no boundaries. There's nothing that you have to have as far as a moral pedigree in order to, as it were, qualify for discipleship in the kingdom of God. So that's the one thing to look for. Another thing is, and I get this line from the miniseries The Chosen, where when Jesus calls Matthew, Peter in this show is very upset with this and is like, "What? That's kind of different." And Jesus turns to Peter and he says, "Get used to different. Get used to different." And I think that summarizes a lot of Jesus' ministry. Get used to things being different because Jesus comes to turn things upside down. And one more thing, Jesus comes to call us where we are, not where we should be. None of us are where we should be, but it's not as if Jesus, as it were, looks around and he's scoping out the right kind of people to be his disciples. No, he calls Matthew from the tax booth, just like he called some from fishing and he called others from other places. Where they are is where Jesus went, and he called them out of that place to be his disciples. And what a great comfort for all of us, no matter where we are, whether we seem to be living life, on the straight and narrow, or whether we are way off the straight and narrow, or whatever situation in life we're in, Jesus comes to us there and says, "Follow me, be my disciple." And no one is at a place that Jesus won't go to call him to be his disciples. No matter where they are, Jesus will go there, even into the place of death itself, even in the place of rebellion, even in the place of being a tax collector or a sinner or a prostitute or whatever it might be. That's where Jesus goes, into the deepest, darkest, most unrighteous of places, in order there to find sinners and to bring them to himself. So that's the first verse about the call of Matthew. Let's kind of see what happens afterward when we have this feast at the home, either of Matthew or someone else, where there is present a number of tax collectors and sinners. So this is verses 10 through 11. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, and Matthew doesn't tell us which house this is. Luke as Luke tells the story, he says this is actually Matthew's house. But in Matthew's version, he just simply says at the house. Jesus reclined at table in the house. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" First of all, as we all know, we're all sinners. So how is there kind of a separate category for sinners? Well, this is kind of common first century Jewish language for those who are kind of social outcast, if you will. So the Greek there is hamartolos, and John Nolan in his commentary says that sinners, in quotes, here should be understood primarily sociologically as identifying those publicly known to be unsavory types who live beyond the edge of respectable society. So I don't know what a common current English term might be. Riffraff, something like that. Social outcast is basically who we're talking about. So when you hear reference to sinners in the kind of the separate category, that's who is being described. So Jesus is eating with tax collectors and riffraff, the socially unacceptable people. And those are classified here as sinners. And notice, too, that he is reclining at table. This is probably common knowledge, but it's worth pointing out that the way that we eat today is not the way that they ate in the first century. We pull up a chair, we sit at our table, and we all are sitting there in these chairs eating our food off the plates on the table. That's not the way they ate in the first century. This is a picture which I couldn't find the source of this. I just took this offline, but it basically shows you what is happening when you're reclining at tables. So you're actually you're laying down and you're resting on one arm, and with your other arm you're reaching across to a table, which is where the food was. And so that's what it means when that was the common Roman posture, which was adopted by the Jews as well for having a meal. So you're not sitting at a table in chairs, but you're reclining on these couches with a table between you and those that you are sharing the food with. And the fact that Jesus is sharing food with these people, enjoying table fellowship with them, of course, is always significant because unlike today, I mean, we have elements of this today because there are certain people maybe that you wouldn't want to share a meal with, sit at a table with, but it was much more pronounced in the first century because those with whom you shared food, you also shared life. And so it was sort of a public acknowledgement that there was a communion, a unity, a friendship, an acceptance between you and the people that you ate with. And so food fellowship or table fellowship or meal fellowship was a big deal. And by Jesus very publicly welcoming to his table tax collectors and sinners and the riffraff and the socially unacceptable kind of people is his way of not just paying lip service to mercy, but incarnating mercy in his attitudes, in his words, in his actions, so that we see he didn't just come to verbally call people to repentance and to show mercy to them, but he exemplified that mercy in embracing them, embracing the ill, embracing those who are wounded, embracing those who are outcast, embracing the riffraff, in order that by doing so, he might bring them to himself. And of course, as this happened, it raised the ire of the Pharisees, the religious elite, because they didn't like what was going on. So they say to Jesus' disciples, "Why in the world? What is up with your teacher? Why? We don't understand it. Why in the world would he stoop so despicably low as to share food with people like that, those people?" And so there's a clear line between who the Pharisees think they are and who those people are. And you could modernize this in any number of ways, all about those people. You know, we tend to draw these lines or establish these boundaries or walls between us and them. And usually the us are deemed as the righteous ones and the them as the unrighteous. Jesus comes along with a sledgehammer and he breaks down all those walls and he says, "Come to me, all you are weary and heavy laden. Come to me, all you who are riffraff. Come to me, all you who are tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. Come to me and find rest. Welcome to my table." So, how does Jesus respond to his critics? That's verses 12 through 13. When he heard it, Jesus said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. By the way, that terminology of go and learn what this means, it was echoed in later rabbinic texts. We're not sure if this was how widespread this kind of terminology was in the first century, but it was certainly picked up by later rabbis when they would urge people to go and study the Torah, study the Tanakh, go and learn what this means. So, first of all, this characterization of people who are ill or sick, that is lifted directly from the Old Testament. So we're going to take a look at Hosea in just a minute, but let's look at some other passages from Isaiah as well as parts of Hosea, in which you have the sick or the ill as a metaphor for the people of God who are in need of God's divine healing touch. So Isaiah 1, 5, and 6. Why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there's no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and raw wounds, not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil. So this is the prophet's depiction of the people of God who are been run over by a truck. I mean, they're just beat up from head to toe with bruises and sores all over the place. That is the situation in which God finds them. They're in need of healing. Isaiah 6:10. Make the heart of this people dull, their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. So here we have them characterized as those who can't hear and who can't see, and their heart is heavy or dull. What they need is this healing, but they won't do that because they continue in their idolatry. And then look at this passage, Isaiah 53:5, all about the Messiah. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. In other words, we are in need of healing, and Christ comes, the Messiah comes, and he is crushed, he is pierced, he is bruised, so that by his wounds we who are sick are receivers of his healing hand. And then Jeremiah 3:22, return, O faithless sons, and I will heal your faithlessness. Behold, we come to you, for you are the Lord our God. So again, there is a need of healing that is talked about here with the unfaithful children of Israel. Jeremiah 8:22 talks about the balm in Gilead. Is there no physician here? Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? Again, same sort of thing. Let's skip on down here to the very last one, Hosea 6:1. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. So all over the prophets, we have this example, this image of them being sick or wounded or beat up, and they're in need of healing. And Isaiah 53 tells us that healing is going to come in the Messiah. And well, now the Messiah is here. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, this is the very purpose for which I came. You're sick. You need my healing. You're bruised. You need my work of ministry. You need my work of restoration. You're beat down. You're in terrible need of a physician, and that is why I came. You're just the same way the prophets described you centuries before, and that is exactly why I came. I came as the great physician of soul and body to give you that healing that you need, and you're going to find it solely and completely in me. Now, let's pick up with that last verse that we looked at, Hosea chapter 6, verse 1, and see how that same chapter later on is the exact one that Jesus is going to quote when he talks about what God truly desires. So in Matthew 9, 12, and 13, Jesus says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, quoting from Hosea 6. So Hosea 6 begins then with that image of being torn and healed, struck down, but bound up. And then when you go down to the 6th verse, we read God saying, I desire steadfast love. That's chesed in Hebrew. I desire chesed and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Now, what's happening here between the Greek and the Hebrew and the Greek is that one aspect of chesed, one aspect of steadfast love is being accented here, and it's the horizontal part with also a vertical dimension, because you can show in Hebrew, you can show chesed to one another. You can show a love or fidelity to one another, just like God shows chesed, steadfast love, covenant loyalty to us. And what God is saying here in Hosea is, listen, I want covenant loyalty, I want steadfast love, and not sacrifice. I want you to know me. I want knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Now, don't misunderstand this, because this is a common Old Testament way of speaking where you have kind of an absolute statement that is spoken for the sake of emphasis, for the sake of hyperbole. But what is being communicated is God wants X more than Y. So I have a quote here from the commentary in the New Testament of the Old commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament that explains this. Sacrifice by synecdoche, that is to say, sacrifice by mentioning one part that represents a whole. So sacrifice by synecdoche probably stands for strict obedience to the commandments of God. As in its original Old Testament context, the not X but Y, so in this case, not sacrifice but steadfast love, not burnt offerings but knowledge of God, that not X but Y form of a seemingly absolute comparison probably meant Y more than X. So here it would be, I desire steadfast love more than sacrifice. I desire knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And in the case of the ministry of Jesus, he's saying, I want mercy much more than sacrifice. So if you were to take what Jesus says in its context and kind of put that in a more expansive and modernized version, it might be something like this. Jesus is saying, I came not as the cheering squad for some non-existent righteous team, because there really is no one who's righteous, no, not one. I didn't come as the cheering squad for some non-existent righteous team, but as the doctor for the ill, the wounded, the dying. What I want is to show mercy to them, as I want people also to show mercy to one another. For without mercy, all those gallons of animal blood shed atop the altar mean diddly squat. Because I came to show mercy, to show the heart of my Father. I came to call sinners to myself. Sinners like Matthew and the other tax collectors, and even you, O Pharisees, that in me you all might be healed. And so Jesus wraps it up here by this quotation from Hosea by saying, listen, you're not getting my ministry. You're not understanding why I came. You're not understanding what the real ministry and mission of the Messiah is all about. I didn't come to find people who are righteous and to pat them on the back and say, oh, you're doing such a great job, keep it up. Because no one is doing that. Read Psalm 14. Read some of the other Psalms that talk about how there's no one righteous, no, not one. There's no one healthy, no, not one. We're all in need of healing. We're all sick, and we're all in need of the healing that comes from the Messiah. So when Jesus calls Matthew, even though it seems to us radically different from his call of Peter and the other fishermen, in reality it's the same. It's just that Matthew more blatantly exemplifies this attitude of rebellion against the ways and the will of God, and yet Jesus goes to where he's at, and he calls him from the tax booth, just like he called Peter from the fishing nets, just like he calls us from wherever we are to be his disciples, because every single one of us is ill, sick, dying, wounded, and Jesus comes to us and he calls us to himself, because he's that physician driven by mercy, that ferocious love of God that will not stop until it finds every single one of us, no matter where we are, and brings us home, gives us healing, and then has a seat prepared for us at his table, where he feeds us, speaks words of truth to us, and continues to love and to heal us into the wholeness that he desires. So the call of Matthew is really the call of every single one of us. Wherever we are, that's where Jesus goes. And he gives us those things we could never produce in ourselves. He gives us really himself and the heart and the healing of his Father. Thanks be to him for that gift. And thank you for watching. It's good to be back. I'll be back next week with another video. Thank you as always for watching. If it's been helpful, please pass it on to your friends. And may the Lord Jesus, that great physician of soul and body, the one who comes to heal us all, grant you healing and hope and restoration, which he gives us completely out of his merciful heart. We'll see you soon.